It's just another day at school. Students roaming about, finding their friends, meeting up for lunch, or finding a teacher to chat with or get help from. But what if I told you that all this peace, tranquility, and normalcy obscure a dark, yet hardly known issue about the school? Every normal day only tries to cover up this difficult, complex predicament: the school-to-prison pipeline. What is it, you may ask? Our teen council explored this topic for the past year. And now, we present to you this far-reaching yet seldom discussed phenomenon harming our education system year after year. In order to better understand the school-to-prison pipeline, its causes and effects, we'll begin by exploring the meaning of inequity, inequality, and injustice as defined by students and community organizations.
I would define inequality and inequity as just people being treated differently for whatever a myriad of circumstances, whether it be their socioeconomic status, the school they go to, their race, or any factor like that, or even a combination of those factors. I think all of those can manifest in inequality or inequity.
Injustice and inequity, I would define it as unfairness, as like a type of plague in our society, I believe. It is a very powerful thing, and it comes in slowly, but once it's noticeable, it grows exponentially.
I think that in terms of schooling, because of redlining, and predominantly people of color in ghettos and poor communities, they don't get as much access to education, and they don't get as much access to good education. So they end up with worse jobs, and the cycle of poverty and crime just continues.
I would define injustice or inequality or inequity as the mistreatment of one group and the privileging of another.
People not being treated the way they need to be treated, and everybody being held to an unreasonable standard, or not being listened to or guided. How I see it manifested, I'd say even in general, just certain students are expected just to kind of conform, and let's say they have some difficulties at school or whatever, they're not really listened to or treated fair.
Now we'll turn to definitions of the school-to-prison pipeline.
I have heard of the school-to-prison pipeline, and my definition is pretty much a system where where our school system takes troubled kids and automatically moves them into a pathway of going to prison instead of helping them veer into a different direction, a better direction.
To my understanding, the school-to-prison pipeline is essentially the system by which students, especially those who are marginalized students of color or students, are facing different disciplinary policies by schools that set them up to be incarcerated in the future.
Yes, I've heard of the school-to-prison pipeline. I've had a class before where I learned about it, but also through outside programs. I would define it as when policies on discipline and cause I guess a chain reaction for students to start being taken into the, I guess you could say jail and all those type of stuff, and them not being able to finish their education.
So the way that I define the school-to-prison pipeline is just a system that doesn't value and prioritize youth in their education or in their futures in terms of what they want to actualize, and instead devalues and prioritizes discipline and policing that ultimately leads to incarceration and encounters with police as well.
So the school-to-prison pipeline is basically when the school system has policies that criminalize students, like policing, or policies that otherwise push students out of school, like school suspension policies that use suspensions to as a central piece of responding to behavior, using a punishment type approach to behavior instead of an approach that's focused on supporting students and restorative practices and helping to solve problems and skill building, not just for students, but skill building for staff and others as well, community members, parents, because everybody's contributing to it. But it's the policies and practices of school districts that are well documented that contribute to students being incarcerated, growing into people who are incarcerated.
Now that we've gotten a general idea of what the school to prison pipeline is, we'll explore how it can be seen in our schools. Beginning by asking students how they see inequity, inequality, and injustice manifested in their school environment.
I think the way that I see injustice and inequity manifested in the LACES school environment would be the way that teachers punish students in class when they're disruptive. More so in middle school than in high school, but I remember a lot of students would act out and teachers would match their level of anger and disruption. So teachers would be yelling and raising the tension in the classroom. And then also teachers would punish different students differently. So they would place a lot more attention on one student if they did something disruptive in class, while if another student did the same thing, they would ignore it entirely and not punish them at all. And I definitely noticed patterns of who was punished and who wasn't, who was ignored when they did one thing and who was called out on it. And I think a lot of that was based on race. I know I picked up on that, and a lot of other students picked up on that as well.
I believe that for me, I'm in Students Deserve, so I was in the part of getting the police out, but before that, they were causing fear among the marginalized communities, and I believe that's one example of how that used to be injustice and inequity.
I think dress code policy is a lot stricter on students of color. I know, for example, bandana tops became a big trend. And so white girls would wear it and it'd be trendy and cute, and admin would be oh, it looks nice. But then, a black or brown student would wear something and a bandana or something, and they would be labeled as gang affiliated.
Many times, issues begin in the classroom and escalate until the police become involved. Because of this, we've asked students whether they think teachers treat students equally in terms of discipline.
But I'll just focus on middle school. I do remember a lot of disruptions in class would be kind of even between all students, but mostly students of color were paid attention to by the teachers. And it was more so with certain teachers than others, but definitely teachers kind of would go in with a certain bias about certain students and would punish them more heavily and be quick to call the school officer in, back when we had a school officer. And they would never do that when other students were on their phones, or when certain students were, I'll just say, on their phones as an example, they would completely overlook it. But then when students of color were doing the same thing, I really do remember they would call them out and punish them, and they did not do that to other kids. So definitely in middle school, teachers act on bias a lot.
I do not think that teachers treat students differently in terms of discipline. I see a lot of unfair treatment. Usually teachers have preferences for students, and they allow them to get up and disrupt the class or for example, one of my teachers takes away phones. Like you just can have it out and he'll take it away. And it's only for certain students because like at my table, people will have their phones out and he won't come bother us. But then he'll go to another table, walking past us, seeing that we have our phones out, and he won't take them, but he'll take theirs.
I think most teachers do. Maybe you'll find some teachers that do have favorite students, and that's where students might feel like, hey, this isn't fair. But yeah, and that's happened before where I was like, why does she like talk to me like that? She doesn't talk to other students like this. But I guess it's not that uncommon to see students with teachers with favorite students. But I don't think anyone has ever told teachers, hey, why do you like he's your favorite or something, or like teacher's pet or something.
No, not at all. Depending on if like it's their favorite student or not, depends on the discipline also. Like things that students may do on campus that aren't exactly correct. If a teacher finds out about it, whether they like the student or not, will most definitely affect the discipline of the student.
Next, we explored the types of violations that students are most often punished for.
At my school, students mostly get in trouble for phones and like smoking. It's unfortunate, but I think there's not a lot of suspension or expulsion at our school. Mostly, if you like are in trouble for being on your phone, you'll get it taken away, sent to the office, or like they'll call your parents, and send out a message to the school being like, "You guys need to stop with this behavior." But it's not a lot of like strict punishment.
I know that we're not allowed to go use the restroom 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after class. Does that make sense? 15 minutes, I think it's 15 or 10 minutes once class has started, because I guess they think we're gonna be going out and walking outside of class and things like that. And we do have staff out there, I guess, supervising us. And there are students who do take advantage, they'll be like, hey, can I use the pass and go walk outside? Use the restroom when in reality, they're just gonna go walk outside. So those are things that students get in trouble for. There's fights. I think that's a valid reason. There shouldn't be fights unless, I don't know. I think from what I know, I'm sure there's other things students get in trouble for, but I just wouldn't know.
I think the biggest problem at my school is drug use. Many students use drugs on Hamilton campus, and a solution would probably be like the admin not brushing it like under the rug for certain students. Because for many of our white students, admin never mentions the use of drug use. So it can be fixed by pretty much them like spreading awareness and actually doing something about it before it like becomes a bigger issue than it already is.
The most severe punitive measure that can be taken against students is expulsion. So we asked students what they think of the policy and when it is appropriate.
I think expulsion is a very serious thing. It's a scary thing, but I don't know, if a student is like putting other students in danger, then I guess that's when it can be taking place. But at the same time, they need to know what the situation is behind that student before they take any actions towards the student. Because if they just how would you say the word expulse? If they just like kick the student out of the schools, how is the student gonna get any better? They're not gonna, I guess, find their problem and heal. So I think we just have to be very careful with that type of policy.
What I think of the policy of expulsion is, I don't think it is always appropriate, especially if the student isn't listened to they don't get to the bottom of why the student is expelled, what motivated their actions, etc. I think in some cases it might be necessary. For example, if a student is like repeatedly or, causes a racist incident or a hate crime or something like that, which really shouldn't be tolerated at all. But if it's not something like that, like, I don't know, graffiti, then yeah, I don't think it's needed.
I think expulsion can be necessary in certain situations, like if a student is overtly violent or there's some for example, like on this campus, every now and then there might be a sexual assault allegation. I feel like that is when expulsion is necessary. For minor occurrences, like what I see is like maybe like if the student has a fight, suspension is necessary, but expulsion, which is like too extreme, is like an extreme.
Many of the problems discussed by students just now are a part of the much larger issue of the school-to-prison pipeline. Despite this fact, many of these students don't have a strong understanding of the system and struggle to define the term.
Have you ever heard of the school-to-prison pipeline before?
Yes. I believe I have. I don't know a lot of detail about it though.
Not really. Like public school is to prepare you with an education, and then you have to turn to crime and end up in prison. I'm not really sure. I don't know a lot about it.
There have been countless studies conducted that explore the effects of disciplinary policies on students. The correlation between these policies and the incarceration rates of Black and brown people has been clearly established. Despite this, many students are unable to advocate for themselves and work to enact change as they are unaware that there is even a term for this system or clear evidence of it.
Being assigned to a school that makes heavy use of suspensions increases the number of days students are suspended and their probability of being incarcerated as adults. These effects are largest for Black and Hispanic students, and especially for Black and Hispanic males. This graph, published in an Education Next article, depicts the effects of suspension and the effects of incarceration on Black and Hispanic and non-minority students, and how they impact Black and Hispanic and non-minority males in particular. Let's first take a look at the effects of suspension. Let's take a look at Black and Hispanic males first. 0.43. That's the average length of a suspension for these students. Yet for non-minorities, it's 0.21. Not that big of a gap, but when we look at males in particular, then this gap really widens. For Black and Hispanic males, the average length of a suspension is 0.82 days. Think about it, that's almost a full day of suspension. Yet for non-minorities, it's barely a quarter of a day, 0.26. And we can really think about how the effects of suspension ultimately play in to incarceration and its effects. In this bar graph, and if we consider males in particular, Black and Hispanic males experience a 4.4% effect on incarceration. Meanwhile, non-minorities, it's 3.7. Again, not a large gap, but it definitely is significant. 1%, or even just around that, is still a lot.
One of the issues raised earlier was that of school police. As defined by the Department of Justice, school resource officers, or SROs, are sworn law enforcement officers responsible for safety and crime prevention in schools. A 2009 study in the Journal of Criminal Justice showed that even when controlling for school poverty level, schools with an SRO had an arrest rate for disorderly conduct about 5 times of that of a school without an SRO. Arrest rates for other charges were not significantly different between the two types of schools. Many of these disorderly conduct cases involve a student making a teacher or administrator upset, but force students to enter the juvenile justice system at a young age. Investing in school police to resolve such behavioral issues could take valuable resources away from the other student services, such as counselors, psychologists, or social workers. Considering this data, we consulted Miguel Dominguez, Director of Education and Youth Policy at Community Coalition, to learn more.
I think the first thing to understand is that all communities want to be safe, right? And they want safe schools. They want essentially what we call public safety, right? Whether it be in schools or outside of it. And so I think the challenge with the policing conversation is that the police have taken ownership of what public safety means. And so when people think about public safety, they think about the police. But we know that when we think about safe schools and safe neighborhoods, it is in the schools or the neighborhoods that have the most police or that are over policed, right? The safest schools in the neighborhoods are the ones that have the most access to resources. And have positive school climate, right? And so you think about your teachers, your counselors, your extracurriculars, your enrichment programs, your field trips, all that stuff, right? That what makes us a safe and thriving school. And so I think, like I said, when we think about the history in terms of like our communities, there has this certain perspective, and there's very real fear of Black and Brown students that have led to the need to have police in schools, because that it is synonymous in safety, right? It hasn't been thinking about like how do we identify and address the root causes that young people are dealing with, and so I think the police has been a bad response in terms of like how we keep young people safe in schools, right? And you hear that a lot now, where for some people it makes them feel safe, right? But for other people, it leads to violence, right? And acts of police aggression. And I mean, I'm even thinking about one of the schools that we work with, Fremont High School, where there was a fight among students. And what the police did was what the school admin did was they called the police, and the police ended up coming in SWAT gear, right? And they ended up with the rubber bullets and a pepper spray that physically injured students, right? And what students essentially said was like, well, the schools knew that the young people were fighting and they had problems with each other, but there wasn't any like mediation or restorative justice or any protocols that were put in place to address that. I mean, let it lead up to that, and the response was to call in the police, right? Which was completely the opposite of what they should have done, right? And so I think, like I said, I think it is a complicated thing because people need to be and feel safe rightfully, but I don't think the police is the institution that is going to bring that sense of safety to a campus and to a community.
There are countless other pieces of data that demonstrate how school disciplinary policies impact incarceration rates.
It's not just bad for one race, but multiple. This infographic, released by the U.S. Department of Education, depicts the number of students, the percentage of students receiving out-of-school suspensions by race, ethnicity, and gender. The race with the highest amount of out-of-school suspensions is African American, with 20%. Next is American Indian or Alaska Native with 13%. After that comes two or more races with 11%. Think about that. 44% of students receiving out-of-school suspension, specifically boys, and all three of them are mainly minorities. Large percentages include Hispanic Latino with 9%, and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander at 7%. And we can see here Asian at 3% and white at 6%. For girls, basically the proportions kind of still remain the same. 12% for African American, which is the highest on this bar graph. 7% for American Indian or Alaska Native, and 5% for two or more races. Those together, or 24% of girls, they're still the three highest. These aren't just numbers. This is an accurate depiction of how prejudiced and biased and even targeted the school-to-prison pipeline is.
According to the American Bar Association Joint Task Force on Reversing the School-to-Prison Pipeline, states that reduced criminalization of youth generated less crime, as demonstrated by the graph. The percentage of youth in juvenile facilities charged with violent offenses and property offenses decreased as much as 57% in the state of Louisiana and by similar percentages in other states.
Although we've seen how widespread the issues that relate to and feed the school-to-prison pipeline are, we've also learned about possible solutions, including an innovative approach to disciplining students known as restorative justice. In addition, community organizations such as Community Coalition and Reclaim Our Schools are working to ensure students are treated fairly and that funds are best used to support our students.
I mean, I think, like I said, I think where you see over policing is not where you see safety, right? And we've seen examples of this where even you might have, I think folks like to pull out like the gun shooting, the shootings at campuses, right? And we have seen that happen in places where police are at those campuses, right? And so the police don't really keep things safe. And over policing doesn't keep things safe. As a matter of fact, it makes students feel unsafe, right? And so I do think that we have to be willing to like listen to those folks who have been negatively impacted and be able to hear from their ideas in terms of like, oh, how do they want to redefine public safety, and what are their thoughts in terms of like what we need to do to change the district and the school systems to be able to address the issues that students are dealing with in a way that doesn't require police, right? So if a student is dealing with a very mental real crisis and it is coming out in terms of like fighting, it's like, again, like how do we connect them to resources instead of like, again, calling the police, right? So there are very real and possible alternatives that we can do so that the police, that we don't give all those responsibilities to the police, right? That can result in very positive results. The first piece is understanding that the schools are a part of the community, right? And being able to build around that. Because I think oftentimes when we think about schooling is we think about like, all right, well, there's these young people and they all need to receive the same education, right? Because and they're all going through the same experiences. And what we found is that isn't true, right? Particularly when you have very much what we call district-wide approaches, it leaves out the specific needs of students who live in communities like South LA. And so if we think about COVID in particular, right? COVID didn't hit all communities hard. What we saw the biggest infection rates and the death rates were in communities like South LA, right? So it would have been very wrong for the district to just be like, all right, well, we're gonna like spread it all equally, like all of our resources, instead of funneling those resources in areas that were impacted the most, right? And so we need to like move to a place of like real equity to understand like how do we address these issues and start with that, right? It's like how do we have an understanding of what these communities are and hear from folks in those communities to think about like what their schools need to look like, what their neighborhoods need to look like, right? And build around that. And be able to build around their vision, right? And so that's what a lot of our work has been around. Even when we think about A through G, our community asked for like college access courses, right? And people didn't believe in that. People thought that we were setting up students to fail. Or even when we did the School Climate Bill of Rights, even teachers themselves who are now leading the Police Free Schools work in alliance with community groups, they were telling us that suspensions were a needed tool in the classroom, right? And that some students didn't deserve to be in a classroom and deserve to be kicked out, right? And so our community fought for that, and they knew they were on the right path. And so I think that's in the battle that we're in right now, right? It's like we're hearing from community. We know that this is a need, and so we know we need to do the work to be able to figure out like, well, how do we do that level of like narrative change, and also policy change, so that we have places, resources in place that can address whatever needs folks feel that the police are addressing, right? It's essentially transforming the whole school and moving into like what we call a place of equity, right? And so like I mentioned, I mean, access to college level courses are a piece of that, and making sure that A through G was a part of that. I mean, right now we're in a fight for what we call a student equity needs index, which identifies schools based on their need, right? From high need to low need, and is based on a number of indicators, including like academic, health factors, neighborhood factors, right? And so what this means is that we can actually target resources and funds to highest need schools so that we can actually have the type of services needed to address the needs of those students, right? And a process in place to be able to hear from the students and parents in that community. And so I think if we're able to get to a place where we have the Senate strong in there, then we can have those additional resources available for them, right? But there's also the mental health resources, right? I think that's what comes up from young people right now, is that they have some very real needs around mental health, right? So if we're able to have social workers and resource wellness centers available at the campuses, then young people have access to resources that they can go to when they're in crisis modes, right? And again, not wait until like it comes out in terms of like fightings or substance abuse, which can land them in trouble, right? And so I do think that the type of change to get there is very comprehensive. And it does require like a lot of even looking beyond schools, right? And so like, how do we equip service providers in the neighborhood to be able to take on those students and those community members to provide that level of service, right? How do we have more services from the county or the city available for young people, where the young people can actually find programs at parks or in other centers, right? So that they don't have to be so over reliant in schools as well either, right? Because we know that the schools can only do so much as well. And so I think it does take that level of work of thinking of like, how do we transform schools, the district, the city, the county, the state as well, right?
Restorative practices or restorative justice are where instead of first like thinking that, okay, if we just punish people, they'll change their behaviors, which doesn't actually have a good track record, of success, and doesn't get at the root cause of behavioral issues, is that you have people, adults, and also sometimes youth, peer mediators who are trained at how to help people address, what's happened. If there's a behavioral action that has harmed or hurt another person, let's get to the problem.
According to the UCLA Civil Rights Project, lower suspensions correlate with higher achievement for every racial group in California. There is, in fact, an inverse relationship in California, where higher test scores are correlated with lower rates of out-of-school suspension. Recent district reductions in the use of out-of-school suspension also show that great progress is possible. Districts should invest in training leaders and teachers and in providing support for students in ways that improve student engagement.
We started this project with a simpler view of the problem, but the events of 2020, the murder of George Floyd, the BLM protests, the pandemic, really brought this issue home for us. As we talked with students, teachers, and organizations, we felt our experiences in school were validated, but we also learned how much bigger the issue was. We met people that had direct experience with the school-to-prison pipeline. We learned this is a problem far greater than the police and incarceration. It's a multidimensional system involving teachers, schools, communities, laws, and governments. There are a lot of ideas for solutions. We don't know which ones are the right ones, but we do know that everyone needs to be involved in the conversation now.